Good morning. It is May 21st, 2019. My name is Katie Schank, and today I'm here with Jerry Gonzalez to conduct an interview for the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Mr. Gonzalez is the founding and current executive director of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials, or Kaleo, and the Kaleo Latino Community Development Fund. Kaleo, a statewide nonprofit and nonpartisan organization, has a mission to increase civic engagement and leadership development of the Latino community across Georgia. Mr. Gonzalez is a native of Laredo, Texas, and received his BS in mechanical engineering from Texas A&M University in 1995. He completed his Master of Public Administration at the Andrew Young School of Public Policy at Georgia State University in 2005. Due to his efforts at Kaleo, Mr. Gonzalez has been recognized by Georgia Trend magazine as one of Georgia's 100 most influential Georgians for several years. There are a number of other accolades that I'm not going to list right now, but he is well recognized and respected in the community. Mr. Gonzalez, I'm excited to speak with you today and look forward to our discussion about voters' rights, voter suppression, the role of grassroots activism in Georgia politics, and the changing demographics of the Georgia voter. And it will be good to speak to you to fill in some of those gaps and broaden the historical narrative. So let's just first start with some biographical information. Tell us about yourself, your parents, where you were born, where you went to school.
Sure. I was born in Laredo, Texas, and I was raised primarily by a single mother. She was a high school dropout that upon divorcing with my father, she ended up getting her GED, and then while she was working 2 to 3 jobs, wanted to essentially increase her salary or increase her wages. So she started going to school at the same time. While she was going to school, she's working 2 to 3 jobs. She was able to get her associate's degree, and I think during that time that I saw my mother struggling so much to provide for our family, I realized the importance and the value of an education and how that can really lift up a family. So from that point forward, she emphasized education is really important, and I'm glad I paid attention to that message.
And so where did you go to high school?
I went to high school at J.W. Nixon High School in Laredo, Texas.
Okay. And how did you decide to go to college to become a mechanical engineer first?
I went through a program, a minority engineering program conducted by the University of Texas at Laredo Junior College at the time. And through that program, I realized I was strong in math and sciences. And in that summer program, they encouraged high school students at the time that were strong in math and sciences to encourage them to go into STEM careers, because there's a big lack of diversity, particularly among the Latino community, in STEM careers. And that is why it opened my eyes to a career I had no idea about. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do that. I started off as aerospace engineer. Okay. During the time I was in college. Unfortunately, it was a downturn in aerospace engineering, but I settled on mechanical engineering because I figured I'd have more options when I graduated from college with regards to entering the workforce.
Okay, so you get your mechanical engineering degree. Where do you go from there?
I was recruited by several companies and had several offers from graduating from college, and then I chose to work with Rockwell Automation. Okay. They're an industrial automation Fortune 500 company based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so I went there for their international training program for field support engineers, and was in a training class of people from all over the world and all over the country. And then they liked my skills there and wanted to additional advanced training for me. So I stayed another year for advanced training at Rockwell.
And how did you eventually make your way to Georgia?
I had to look up Georgia on the map, actually. I did not know where Georgia was. They said, we have a project for you in Georgia. We want to work, and interestingly enough, it was for printing phone books. And that was a state-of-the-art machine at the time for printing phone books for Bell South all over the Southeast. Okay. We were installing that machine in partnership with a Russian company. And essentially, we were able to partner and get the machine started up. It was during the Olympics. I fell in love with Atlanta.
Warmer than Milwaukee.
It was a lot warmer than Milwaukee, and the local regional office needed my skills in the office. And so they recruited me to relocate after my advanced training in Milwaukee.
Okay. So you find yourself here in Georgia, in Atlanta, and explain your road then to politics and political activism, and when
Sure.
you decided to go to the Andrew Young School.
So I did a lot of work in industrial automation, and I was still very heavily involved with the Society of Mexican American Engineers and Scientists at the time. I was on their board nationally and was helping promote STEM careers for particularly Mexican Americans. I realized that there was a lot of work that needed to be done in Georgia. The Hispanic community was new, it was newly arriving, and it was growing at a significant pace when I was here. So I took a look around, and while I was doing work in engineering, I realized for myself that I like working with people more than I like working with machines. Mm-hmm. So I decided to take a conscious effort to start beefing up my credentials and started grad school with a master's in public administration, knowing that I wanted to work in public policy with regards to that. At first it started off with an interest in STEM careers, but then as I learned more about the Latino community here in Georgia, the needs certainly changed from that. So while I was working and getting my master's degree, I was recruited by MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, as their first policy analyst in the Southeast. Oh. And that's where I got my break in policy work.
Okay. And so where does the seed then from Kaleo come in? Is this in the back of your head when you're at the Andrew Young School? You're working with the legal defense. How does that vision come to be?
So that didn't happen until after probably a year working with MALDEF. Realized that doing policy work was really important. However, there wasn't an engagement from the community. So it was important to speak up on behalf of Latinos on important policy matters at various capitals across the Southeast. But by the same token, there was no community members engaged in that discussion. So I worked very closely during my first legislative session at the Georgia Capitol with the recently elected Senator Sam Samarripa and Representative Pedro Marin. And we were pushing forward legislation from an economic perspective to expand driver's license access to all residents in Georgia without regarding immigration status. Mm-hmm. We worked closely at the time. The leadership in the Senate had just flipped from Democrat to Republican, and we were working with Republican leadership on the legislation. It moved quickly through committee process, and in fact, it actually passed the Georgia Senate when it was brought up for a bill, and then the next day it was recalled and rejected. And that's sort of when we started seeing some of the anti-immigrant backlash in the state.
What year was that?
I believe that was 2002 or 2003.
Okay.
So it was the first session of Senator Sam Samarripa and Representative Pedro Marin. So after the learning I was a policy analyst at the time. After the learning process with that, we were invited to go to Athens, Georgia, to have a community town hall meeting with primarily the immigrant community. It was all in Spanish, and it was at the library there. They have an auditorium, and the auditorium was packed, standing room only, people and women and children on the aisles, sitting in the aisles, and they wanted to know what happened with the driver's license bill. So that's when we realized that in order for us to be successful in policy, we really need to cultivate leadership. We need to cultivate policy engagement for the Latino community in order for us to be successful and to fight off some of the anti-immigrant sentiment that we started seeing creeping up at that time. Mm-hmm. So because of that, we created Kaleo at that time, is when the idea happened after that Athens meeting, we were riding back to Atlanta, and that's when we essentially started Kaleo.
So it was born somewhere on 316 or 78?
It was born on between the IHOP in Athens and 316 was where Kaleo was born. In having a conversation, we wanted to create a catalyst for civic engagement and leadership development in Georgia. We knew it was going to happen with the demographic trends that we were seeing, with the growth that Georgia was seeing at the time, and we wanted to make sure that we got in front of that to make sure that we were able to provide some engagement for our community.
So have those trends been, those growth trends and population trends hit those marks that you thought? Have they surpassed them?
I think they've gotten, the trends have outpaced our expectations. Certainly, Kaleo celebrated 15 years just last year.
Congratulations.
And we have seen significant growth and engagement. As an example, when we started as an organization, there were only 10,000 Latinos registered to vote in the state. The most recent study that we did in 2016, that number jumped to 240,000.
Wow.
In the last couple of presidential cycles that we've seen, including the last midterm in 2018, we saw the Latino participation rate in Georgia outpace national Latino participation rates. In fact, one study by the City University in New York has said that the demographic that was outperforming all the other demographics with the Latino community in Georgia for the 2018 election. So the Latino community has grown tremendously. The Latino community has expanded. And given the tight margins in the gubernatorial election that we saw of less than 55,000 votes making the difference in an election, I would say that the Latino community right now today has the ability to be able to shift a statewide race.
All right, so tell me a little bit about who did you see? Were there predecessors to Kaleo in Georgia, or was this just a vacuum that needed to be filled?
Well, actually, I don't think that there is another organization like Kaleo anywhere else in the country. I think that the model that we had, that we looked at, was Georgia Association of Black Elected Officials, GABIO, but we also looked at sort of NALEO, nationally and what they were doing nationally. But when we looked, we wanted to make sure that our organization was nonpartisan. We recognized that we needed to work with both sides of the aisle to make policy progress in Georgia, and we wanted to make sure that we took that into consideration when we first started. So really, there was not much of a predecessor that we could really look at, and we charted our own way. We wanted to focus on the infrastructure that was needed to create a catalyst for more engagement in the community. And we thought that focusing on leadership development and civic engagement were the two pillars in which we needed to focus.
Okay. So you've mentioned GABIO. Are there other organizations that you partner with that you feel like are doing complementary work? Because often, people will divide into different groups. Like, okay, I'm going to help Latino voters and I'm going to help Black voters. Is there a crossover?
I think that there is. I mean, back when we started, one of the first organizations to help us in everything that we were doing was the Coalition for the People's Agenda, and that was run by and still run by Helen Butler. And I think that we learned a tremendous amount of what the work that they were doing in the broader civil rights community, in particular with the African American community, and we counted on them to be really strong allies throughout our efforts at Kaleo. And in fact, we're still in partnership today. I think that the way in which civic engagement is viewed now is much more evolved than it was back then. Back then, each organization was focusing on their own communities. Now we have Pro-Georgia that we've helped create, Coalition for the People's Agenda, Kaleo, and 12 other organizations created this organization called Pro-Georgia. All of these organizations that work with Pro-Georgia at the beginning had civic engagement as one of the core things that they did. We kept doing our efforts in our own communities and kept losing with regards to our community. We were tired of that. We said we would be stronger if we worked together. And we focused our efforts to work together. So I think that that's the part of the evolution that happened as we created a state table for civic engagement groups here in Georgia to build that synergy of working together. And now we've got well over 30 plus groups that are involved with Pro Georgia. We collaborate with a broad, diverse group of stakeholders and community activists around the state, and we do our work smarter. We make sure that we can talk to African American, Asian American, and Latino voters when we're doing our efforts. And I think we've seen a tremendous payout. The areas in which we do work increases voter participation anywhere between 5 to 10% voter turnout.
That's significant.
And you ask a politician what percentage increase in voter turnout, and they would say anywhere between 3 to 5 is a huge success.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing about 5 to 10%, and that's because we're engaging with people that have not been invited to be a part of that process. I think that that's essential.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you said, we were in these communities and we kept losing, what does that mean? You weren't getting people registered, the candidates you wanted to get elected to office weren't getting elected, legislation wasn't passing. What does a loss mean?
Well, a loss meant that, from a policy perspective, we kept getting hit with anti-immigrant legislation year after year after year, and we were not able to essentially, one elected official told us, what do I care about the Latino community? They don't turn out to vote, and they're not registered to vote. So that really, I think, made it hit home for us to focus in our efforts to make sure that we engage the community to be active in raising their voices in the policy deliberations, but also made sure that we educate the community about how policymakers are voting and passing policies associated with the Latino community. For example, English-only constitutional amendment has been proposed many times. We've beaten it back many times. We've beaten it back because we've worked in coalition with refugee groups, Asian American groups, African American groups, and other civil rights groups to push it back, and it hasn't passed the state. We've had help of Republican legislators in killing very bad anti-immigrant legislation because of the work that we've been doing in coalition with other groups as well. So we were losing, and it was not just impacting the Latino community. So in forming coalitions and really, I think, with a lot of synergy and a lot of focus into what we're doing, both from a policy perspective as well as in voter engagement, we've had tremendous successes now.
So you talk about, and I'd like to expand on this in a few different ways, about being a nonpartisan organization. Yep. And you just mentioned the Republicans who are in the Senate who are helping to beat back some of this Correct. Anti-immigrant legislation. Do you try to promote that fact? Because I think the general sentiment is that Republicans, given people who are in higher elected offices at the federal level, are all anti-immigrant. So is there an effort to kind of downplay or to get rid of that stereotype?
So let's take a look at one industry for the state, the Georgia agricultural industry. It's the number one industry for the state, $42 billion in GDP that it produces for the state. Mm-hmm. If you look at the same demographics that are providing the work for our agricultural industry, it's nearly about 70% of the workforce in agriculture nationally is estimated to be undocumented immigrants. So Georgia can't succeed economically without immigrant labor. Mm-hmm. I think our politicians recognize that. Many politicians recognize that. They recognized that when Georgia passed HB 87. HB 87, Georgia felt the pain of economic losses, and our farmers felt the pain of economic losses when we scared migrant workers from coming to the state of Georgia because of that. $200-some million of crop losses were felt when Governor Deal passed that law, signed that into law. So that being said, it's about economics, it's about the future of Georgia, and I think that both Democrats and Republicans care about the future of Georgia, and I think that we've been able to make sure that we can talk about the rights of immigrants, but also talk about the economic impact that immigrants are contributing year after year in this state.
And so then when you think about Kaleo as a nonpartisan organization, how do you reconcile your own politics and political beliefs with working as a nonpartisan?
Well, my own political beliefs have to be on check. When we do the work, when I'm on the clock with Kaleo, we have to maintain a nonpartisan field, certainly. And we've been able to do that over the many years. We do hold elected officials accountable, regardless of party, when they deviate from the values and interests of the Latino community, in particular on immigration and voting rights. As an example, we were one of the organizations that started calling President Obama the deporter in chief, because he deported more immigrants than any other president prior to his term. So we hold elected officials accountable on both sides of the aisle, not just Republicans. And there are pro-immigrant Republicans and Democrats in this state. So I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of noise from the white nationalist, the xenophobic side of politics. And that exists within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party as well.
Given the state of current immigration policy in the United States, there's obviously a lot of disenfranchisement and intimidation of Latino voters. What types of action is Kaleo taking to address those issues?
Well, when we first engaged in the 2018 election, we were uncertain. This is the first midterm election post-President Trump. And the fact that President Trump has really taken a white nationalist agenda to target Latinos every step of the way. He's been targeting immigrants with anti-immigrant policies left and right. And I think that we really have seen the reality of what elections have impact in our community. So we were uncertain how the Latino community was going to be engaging in the midterm elections, but we found out rather quickly that the Latino community was paying attention, was interested in engaging, and was interested in pushing back on some of that anti-immigrant rhetoric that we were seeing from the White House. So it was really, I think, inspiring moment that our community, number one, was engaged, number two, was willing to turn out, and in fact, broke records in Latino voter turnout for a midterm election here in Georgia.
Did you come across, as you were trying to register people to vote, people who were apprehensive, not because of their own status, obviously they would have to be residents, but because of relatives that they may have been living with or people that they knew?
Prior to 2018 election, I think we saw some of that. During the 2018 election, what we saw was actually people being prevented from voting that were real U.S. citizens, eligible voters, because of Georgia's voting practices and voter verification processes. With the exact match as one example, if you were missing a hyphen in a database, if your voter registration form had a hyphen, if the database didn't have a hyphen, you were flagged as a non-citizen and weren't allowed to vote in many situations. So these were many, about 80,000 voters that were impacted in the last election. And that's why we engaged in litigation against the state, because we thought that they were trying to suppress voter participation.
And is this separate litigation? Because I know that's coming from, there are a number of organizations, and Stacey Abrams is heading one that is bringing litigation against the state. So are you joining together in that with other organizations, or are they separate?
This was a litigation that was led by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. So we, along with other organizations, not including Stacey Abrams' organization, because that was a gubernatorial campaign. So we didn't engage with that.
Okay. Let's see. So it's interesting, and to continue to talk about the current administration at the federal level and even in the state, about the rhetoric that we hear, whether it be from white nationalists or from supposedly mainstream politicians, that there's something unpatriotic about grassroots organizing, about protesting against the government, or even holding the government accountable, questioning them. What would be your response to that?
That's the foundation of our democracy. The foundation of our democracy has been to always strive to make it better. Participation and engagement are what makes this country better. If we had more participation and more engagement, we would continue to make strides to make this country better. So I think that talking about being unpatriotic is really, I think, not based in our history. Our history of this country values a challenging of the government to do better by its citizens. And that's really what we are engaged in doing is this is democracy work. We want our democracy better, and we have a right and a duty to uphold those values that we have near and dear and make sure that we protect those values and those rights that we have as citizens in this country.
So what, we've been talking about Kaleo as just kind of this large umbrella, and I know there are a number of different arms of it, different things that you do. Can we talk a little bit more
Sure.
about that? So I know, for example, there's the Georgia Latino Vote, and then in addition, other things you're doing.
Yep. So engaging with voters is one of the primary things that we do. We engage with voters to inform and educate them about elections that are happening. Many Latinos around the state have not been sought after by politicians or by parties to engage in the electoral process. So they have not turned out to vote historically in the past. We're changing that as we make inroads in our community, and they recognize the importance that elections have. So we've done that in local elections, we've done that in midterm elections, we've done that in presidential elections. So year after year, as we engage with our community in that way, they become more regular voters, and we're starting to see more of that. So engaging with voters is one of the core things that we do. And we do that in a nonpartisan way by educating them about the voting process. We educate them about what they can do to overcome some barriers that they may see, and then educating them about their rights that they have to exercise in their franchise of voting.
And so how do you do that? So I'm here with you today at the Kaleo offices, and it's a small office, and I've seen you and one other person. I know that that's not the extent of your staff, of your volunteers. So what does that look like?
Well, Kaleo has grown from a staff of one, which was myself when we first started the organization, to now we have a staff of 4.
Okay.
Part-time staff can go up to about 25 people that we have working with us that are having face-to-face conversations with our community at their doors. So we knock on doors, we make phone calls, we engage in social media. So our footprint in the state of Georgia has grown tremendously as well. And we engage with community leaders all across the state as well. We've cultivated the concept of leadership, service leadership around the state. We have developed a pipeline of leadership through our Kaleo Institute for Leadership and Kaleo Leadership Council. We also have a Latino Leaders Summit. We bring community members together all the time, and through that network of community leaders, we've been able to have a tremendous outreach and impact in the communities that we serve.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about this leadership and leadership institutes, are you grooming people for elected office, or I imagine there are many layers at which you want to have Latino leadership? Well,
so we adopt the principle from the UGA Fanning Institute for Leadership. Everybody has the capacity to lead. Mm-hmm. We, as leaders in the community, have to create the space for us to realize that potential in every single person that we come in contact with. So whether they speak English or not, whether they're citizens or not, they have the capacity to lead. And we make sure that we create the space to be able to do that. So we partner with the University of Georgia's Fanning Institute for Leadership, and we have the grassroots leadership program curriculum that we utilize to teach people basic leadership skills. What is a leader? How do you communicate effectively? How do you manage diversity? How do you create win-wins in a community? So those are the types of skills that we teach. And of course, from our perspective, from Kaleo's perspective, policy is always important. So the conversations always turn to policy and how we can make policy better serve our Latino and immigrant communities as well.
And are you at the Capitol a lot as Kaleo, trying to influence policy? Is that part of your mission?
We build relationships with elected officials and policymakers all the time. We have to monitor and track legislation as it's being developed and considered. And we do testify for or against legislation that would be impacting our community. So we've been involved in the legislative session every single year that we've existed as an organization, because policy does have tremendous impact, and we make sure that we are there to be a voice, one of many voices for the Latino community. And we want to make sure that we can protect the Latino community against anti-immigrant legislation. We're happy to say that in the last 2 legislative sessions, we've not had anti-immigrant legislation see the light of day by reaching the governor's desk. So we've been very happy about that.
Is this, though, I mean, this must be a constant battle, especially given what's happening at the higher levels of government. So do you see that continuing? Do you feel like you've established a strong base? I mean, I know you can never rest when you do this type of work, but are you kind of seeing big challenges coming down the road in the near future with legislation?
Certainly, there's always challenges with legislation. I think part of the issue has been making sure that policymakers understand the contributions that Latinos make to the state. And once they understand the contributions that Latinos make to the state, then they realize that we can't mess with the progress of the state moving forward. If we care about Georgia continuing to hum its economic engine moving forward, the growth of the Latino community is integral to that. Whether it's the carpet factories in Dalton, the poultry processing plants in Gainesville, or down in Moultrie picking onions and all of our agriculture that's down there, or the service industry with the restaurants and hotels here in the Metro Atlanta area, construction industry as well. If we want the economic engine of progress to continue moving forward, we need to make sure that we pay attention to the Latino and immigrant populations, and I think policymakers get that.
Have you seen that in the, not just in the policy, like once they're in elected office, but in the past elections? Have you seen candidates altering their campaigns at all? I mean, I think that for the gubernatorial race, so much focus was on the black or the white, the urban or the rural, but did you see focus?
We remember in the gubernatorial race, the deportation bus that candidate Michael Williams, I believe his name was going around scaring people with a deportation bus. Every single candidate for governor on the Republican side had an anti-immigrant ad that they were pushing that fit with the narrative. As soon as the candidate for the Republicans was selected, that tone changed. So I think that policymakers in general do get that essentially both mainstream economic-focused, Chamber of Commerce-focused Republicans recognize that beating on immigrants is not the way forward for our state, and I think politicians are starting to recognize that.
But it's interesting that it still exists so strongly at that primary level.
Primary voters are not general election voters. Okay. So general election voters are more mainstream, and primary voters are more, I would say, the loyalists in either party. So the loyalists certainly in the Republican Party at this point seem to be very Trumpian in their views on immigration, which is very white nationalist, anti-immigrant, I would say. But certainly that's not the truth in many Republicans that I've spoken to.
So, you know, we're talking a lot about when there's a midterm election, when it's a presidential election year, as it will be in 2020. There's always lots of buzz about voter suppression or different groups, different policies. These things are happening all the time, though, in these off years. What are your strategies during those off years to keep these things in front of the public, these issues of voter suppression, of anti-immigrant sentiment and rhetoric?
So the one thing is we continue to educate our community about their rights and how they can assert their rights against some of these barriers for them to fully exercise their right to vote. So that's the first and foremost. Secondly, we make sure that litigation is always an option against any elections processes that may limit or diminish the power of our communities to be able to exercise their full effect on voting. So litigation is always a part of the strategy that we have. And we make sure that we work with other organizations that share the same values, that have that in their mind as well. So education, litigation are going to be important because in 2020, Georgia is a swing state. What we've seen in the last trends has been astounding here in Georgia. Mitt Romney won Georgia by over 300,000 votes. Trump won Georgia by about 200,000 votes. Governor Kemp won Georgia by less than 55,000 votes. So the margins in Georgia are getting tighter.
And rapidly.
And rapidly getting tighter. The Latino electorate, the Asian electorate, Asian American electorate, and the African American electorate are paying attention to voting like never before in this cycle. So I think we're going to see certainly spikes in voter participation in come 2020, and Georgia is going to be a swing state.
And so much of Kaleo's mission is to inform those Latino voters and Asian American voters and Black voters of their power, to realize they really have a lot of power in these coming elections.
Certainly our community, in the last gubernatorial election, if our community would have turned out to vote at 100% or 80%, we would maybe see a different outcome in the election. Mm-hmm. We could see different outcomes in lots of elections by holding elected officials accountable on what they say and what they're doing in elected office by turning out to vote, listening to candidates, what they're saying about the immigrant community. So that's one thing that I think is important. We've seen more candidates reach out to the Latino community. We've seen more candidates reach out in Spanish to the Latino community, which is critically important here in this state as well.
Mm-hmm. So we talk about the shifting demographic of the Georgia citizen. That demographic isn't necessarily being reflected in who's sitting in office. How long do you think it is until that matches? Like the demographic of the population is represented in the demographic that's sitting in the House and the Senate of the state, and if it's not possible, is it important?
So let's look at history a little bit. There's over 3,000 or more elected positions in the state. When we first started as an organization, there were only 4 Latino elected officials at that time.
And are we talking, so I said House and Senate, but then there's local and
there's
school
local
boards, and so that's
and now we're more than a handful, more than 2 handfuls.
Okay.
So there's probably about 12 Latino elected officials at the legislature, at local levels as well. So that's really a significant jump from 3 to 4 to 12.
Over about 15 years.
Over about 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the challenge has been also that Georgia still has many repressive voting schemes in place. At-large voting is a big problem that keeps minority communities out from being elected into office. The redistricting process is something that we're particularly interested in. One example that comes to mind, the city of Gainesville used to be in one legislative district. That legislative district was reaching minority population of about 49%. In the last redistricting process, they carved up Gainesville to be in 4 legislative districts to dilute minority voting strength as an example. So at-large voting processes are other barriers that keep minority communities from exercising their full potential to elect their candidates of choice. Mm-hmm. They may not be candidates that necessarily are Latino, Asian, or African American, but they respect and value those immigrant or minority communities that they represent. And that's what's important, really.
Okay. So it would be wonderful to have people who look like them in office, someone who looks like you, someone who's come from your background, but at the end of the day, if there's someone representing what's important to you that is of the greatest value?
Representation and respect are essential. And that's why we were part of the litigation in Gwinnett County, because Gwinnett County in the last redistricting process, they made an effort to dilute and diminish the minority community's ability to be able to elect candidates of choice. In the last election, the litigation was still ongoing, but with the results of the last election in Gwinnett County, demographics changing so quickly, there was a African American, Asian American, and elected both to the school board and to the county commission. So with those changes, the litigation was dismissed, but we were making the case in the litigation that both, African American, Latinos, and Asian Americans share interests, share values, and would be able to make sure that we elect candidates of choice through coalition building as well. So that's critically important, because that usually in voting rights cases, singular race is what's considered for most voting rights cases, but this was a multiracial coalition that withstood the scrutiny of a federal court, and the litigation was moving forward. The demographics changed quicker than what we thought, so that case was dismissed.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier, Kaleo has celebrated its 15th anniversary. What are your hopes for it when you hit your 20th and your 25th and your 30th anniversary? What are the big plans going forward?
So Kaleo will continue to make tremendous strides in being a catalyst for engagement for the Latino community. We will continue to work in coalition with other groups. There's power in us working together. I think that we're going to see tremendous impact in the 2020 election in the very short term. In the long term, I think that Latinos, Asians, and African Americans are going to be the deciding factor in the outcome of future elections in Georgia at every single level of engagement. I think is important to recognize. And we're going to be fighting battles associated with dismantling voting schemes that dilute and diminish the power of minority communities' ability to be able to exercise their full potential in electing candidates of their own choice.
So what is your hope for Georgia politics going forward? The whole premise of this project is charting the rise of two parties in Georgia. I mean, it's important to have two parties, but it almost seems like we never hit that sweet spot. It's either one party's in control and then we swing to the other. So do you see that happening again? Are we going to be able to strike a balance in Georgia? I
think so. There's people in both parties that recognize, respect, and appreciate the contributions that Latinos and immigrants bring to the state. And I think that this state's future is bright if we can embrace that. And that's sort of the work that we have before us is, are we going to embrace the change that's happening in Georgia, the vital change that's happening in Georgia for Georgia's economic prosperity? We need to embrace all of our community members, not just some of them.
And you talk about, you've just had incredible impact and the numbers reflect that. And you also mentioned that there's not an organization like Kaleo probably anywhere in the country. Do you have people reaching out to you from other states saying, Jerry Gonzalez, you're doing amazing work. What can we do in our state?
Yeah, certainly. We've gone to Minnesota, we've gone to South Carolina, we've gone to North Carolina. There are organizations that are doing similar work, focused on either immigrant rights or Latino civil rights, but focused on the two core pillars of our organization, which is civic engagement and leadership development. Some organizations have those as part of what they do, but not central to what they do. Certainly, I think that the Latino community is continuing to evolve. The Latino community is new in Georgia, and I think that we started with a clean slate here in Georgia with predominantly an immigrant population. We were able to chart our course, and I think it's replicable in other places.
And any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with people who might be watching this 20 years from now in the archive?
I think it's important to note something that's happening right now. There's Judge Dax Lopez is a state court judge serving in DeKalb County, Georgia. He's a stellar judge. He was appointed by Republican Governor Sonny Perdue to serve in DeKalb County. He's been reelected twice by the citizens of DeKalb County, which means DeKalb County is a very democratic county. Mm-hmm. So he's the example, I think, of the future of our state, where even though he is conservative, he's been able to win elections in a democratic county like DeKalb County for a judgeship position, which not many voters go all the way down to the ballot and vote on judges. So that's significant. He was nominated by President Obama to serve as a federal judge, which would have been a lifetime appointment. Mm-hmm. He would have been the first Latino out of the state of Georgia to be appointed to federal judgeship out of Georgia. And that's significant. President Obama would not have put him forward if Judge Lopez did not have the support of both U.S. Senator Isaacson and U.S. Senator David Perdue. Mm-hmm. They were both encouraging Judge to move forward with that. I think from a historical perspective, we need to recognize that. Then white nationalists started raising their concerns about Judge Lopez and his affiliation with our organization and our position primarily on immigration reform.
Your organization, you're speaking of Kaleo.
Correct.
Yes.
Because
okay.
Judge Lopez was involved with our organization, was a board member for many years, over a decade, before he was a judge. And even when Governor Perdue appointed him, he was still affiliated with our organization. Okay. So clearly there was no issue then. When white nationalist organizations started attacking Judge Lopez in the U.S. Senate, and then local white nationalist anti-immigrant organizations started attacking him as well, Senator Perdue got cold feet and withdrew his support. So clearly, President Obama was not going to fight for the nomination if one of the home senators was not. That's the way the nominating process happens for federal judgeships. Mm-hmm. Senator Isaacson maintained his support of Judge Dax Lopez. So now that happened in 2011. Moving forward to what's happening today. Governor Brian Kemp has a judicial nominating committee as well. And Judge Dax Lopez is on the short list for Stone Mountain Superior Court appointments. And the same white nationalists are attacking them as well and calling on Governor Kemp to remove him from consideration. And again, it's part of this cycle that it's a shame that we're seeing white nationalists, I think, have an undue voice in this process. For a stellar judge that has remarkable credentials, would be able to serve our state with dignity and honor, but is being tarnished simply just because he's Latino, and simply because he was associated with an organization that promotes civic engagement and leadership development. So it's a shame that we're reliving some of that history. But I think that I'm hopeful that Governor Kemp will still consider his credentials first and foremost, and his ability to be able to have won re-election in DeKalb County as a way to move our state forward.
Well, it'll be interesting if someone is watching this 20 years from now to see if some of these things that you've talked about come to fruition. Well,
I think that Judge Dax Lopez is going to be a name that's going to be etched in Georgia's history in greater ways than we see right now. Mm-hmm.
Well, Mr. Gonzalez, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with us today. You've really helped to broaden the historic record and tell us about all the amazing work that Kaleo is doing.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.